Go ahead.
Okay. So, hi, my name is Dawn Holy, and I am with OsteoStrong. We are a musculoskeletal strengthening center. We help people improve bone density. And what if you were able to get in a time machine and look forward and see if you were going to have a bone density issue 10 or 20 years down the road, or if you had a bone density issue now? Well, I'm hoping that our latest technology that we're going to learn about today, called REMS Echolight, is going to give us a little bit more ability to know what might happen to our bone density in the future. And we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. David Weimer, who is a double board certified radiologist and in nuclear medicine, and also a professor emeritus at University of Florida. So, welcome and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So, I wanted to start out with just can you give me a little bit of an explanation of what REMS Echo Light is and how does it work?
Hey, we'll use the eponym of REMS as we're talking about this because it actually stands for radio frequency echographic multispectroscopy. And there's no way we want to say that every single time. What that means is that you're using radio frequencies, which is basically radar, and you're marrying that with an ultrasound image to tell where you are. So you've got two things going on with REMS for evaluating the bone density. The radio frequency portion of it measures the bone integrity underneath, and that acts as an indicator of the actual overall bone health and bone strength.
Hmm, amazing. And so, does REMS, because we're very familiar with DEXA and DEXA technology, does REMS measure something different than DEXA technology does?
Yes. Now, Dex has been with us since about 1987. It's um, dates back to my era when I was starting. So it's been around a long time. When it came out, it was the first tool that we had to really get a good measurement of the bone density, and we were equating bone density with bone strength, which is partially true, but it was the best tool we had. And it was a good tool for evaluating the overall bone loss in people as you age or as you're on medications or other issues that you've got where you're losing bone mineral density as a way of following it and determining fracture risk. Now, subsequent to that, one of the things that was missing was the evaluation of the underlying bony structure, not just the density, not just the calcium that's there, but the actual underlying integrity of the struts and the scaffolding inside the bone, in the bone marrow, as it were, that helps hold the bone together. That's what really gives the strength against fracturing and the torsion on a bone that leads to fractures, as opposed to just the thickened calcium on it. For example, there's a disease called osteopetrosis. Uh, it's stone bones. They're very, very dense bones. It's a congenital problem. And if I did a DEXA scan on those, the bones would be incredibly calcified, incredibly dense. And you would think, based on our history of using DEXA to evaluate bone strength, that they ought to be really strong. You've got these very, very dense bones. The problem is they're not. You're putting it in the cortex, and the underlying micro texture of the bone itself is not improved. And these patients are at extremely high risk of fracture. And it's called a brittle bone disease because even though they're very, very dense, they break easily. And we weren't measuring at that time, we didn't have a good way to measure the underlying integrity of that bone above and beyond that. We just knew that even though they were very dense, they were very fragile.
Hmm.
So now we've got REMS that's come along, and it's not just looking at the the calcium density and the reflection of the radio frequency from the calcium, but also the underlying microtexture of the bone, those struts, the scaffolding inside the bone. So we're getting a good measure of that portion of the bone that is actually providing additional strength to the bone to avoid fractures. Now, for the longest time, all we had was DEXA. It was our best tool.
Mhm.
And like a lot of things in medicine, it's what you got, it's what you deal with, it's all we have. So you use it to the best that you can. Like the old time doctor going to your house and just patting you on the head and putting a cold compress because that was all he had. Um, we're beyond that now. And DEXA just recently, in the past couple of years, has gone another step. And a lot of the equipment, not a lot, some of the equipment out there now has added on a trabecular bone score to the DEXA scan to actually look at that underlying bony matrix, the bony integrity. So that's something new. Not all machines have it. As a matter of fact, it's a small fraction of machines that have that. Everybody is still focused on DEXA and the bone mineral density because for so long, everybody was trained that that's what you looked at. So
Mhm.
that's what they've used. But now they do have that, and that's a good tool. REMS does that same thing. It looks at the underlying strength of the bone, not just the bony mineral density, so that we can evaluate that. Both of them, uh, if you have a DEXA with trabecular bone score or you have a REMS, you're basically looking at the same similar things. You can get a same similar feel for how the integrity of that bone is, and that would be good. One of the biggest differences is, of course, with DEXA, you've got the radiation exposure. Granted,
Mhm.
it's very, very low, and we don't really worry about it because if you need it, you need it. You need the study. If you're going to do
Mhm.
multiple studies, you certainly could run the risk. There are patients with a disease called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is another congenital problem. And these patients have bones that are the underlying matrix is very poorly formed and they're subject to fractures because they don't have the strength. Historically, we've always done DEXA scans to follow the uh, the treatment of those patients to try to keep their bone density up. But you've got little kids and you're giving them lots of scans, and a lot of little adds up after a while. So it's
Mhm.
nice to have the ability to do something that you can evaluate these patients without the radiation, and you get the same information in terms of bone fracture risk and what to do about it.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, DEXA, there is something called a trabecular score that could do a similar thing to what REMS is doing in measuring the microarchitecture in addition to the strength, the outside cortical bone. But not every machine has that, and you would have to, you would know whether your report had that trabecular score or not,
You
right?
like to ask going in, are you
Okay.
gonna be able to give me a trabecular bone score along with this? Or does your machine do that? Or should I go somewhere else? Or what have you? I think it's to me, it's part and parcel of the whole story. It's part and parcel of what you need to evaluate to get good information of what's going on.
And so that might be why you might choose REMS over DEXA. Is that true? Or is that why might you want a REMS score over a DEXA score?
I think that if you can get DEXA with a trabecular bone score, that you're probably doing more or less the same thing you do with REMS. And that to me, um, it'd be six of one, half dozen the other,
Except for the radiation.
except for the radiation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Is there a reason to get both DEXA and REMS if your DEXA doesn't have a trabecular bone score?
Certainly, I think that what we've seen is that when we do a REMS after a patient's had a DEXA scan, they're oftentimes discordant. And the reason they're discordant is we're not measuring the same things. The DEXA scan without the trabecular bone score is only looking at the calcium density, not the underlying, you know, scaffolding of the bone that you get with the REMS. So if you had for me, for example, if I had a DEXA scan and it shows me osteoporotic, okay, the knee jerk reaction is you're osteoporotic, you've got an increased risk of fracture. True. How bad is that risk? In other words, do I know what the underlying microarchitecture is to determine that? So you could get a REMS and you could say the REMS is showing that it's even though the bone mineral density is really low, the underlying scaffolding is still reasonably strong. So therefore your fracture risk is less. I would personally use that in my treatment decisions. If I have a patient with osteoporosis, really bad osteoporosis, and you're trying to determine, am I going to put them on some kind of medication? I tend to not like to put people on medications. If you don't need to, you don't really want to be on it. And you certainly, most of these medications, they're not benign. Most of them have a low profile of side effects, but there are side effects. Alendronate, for example, is associated, long-term use is associated with osteonecrosis of the jaw, bone fractures in the femur. So these aren't things that you really you want to do if you don't have to take those medications. So you'd like to have something else to help determine whether or not you need to take the next step, as opposed to vitamin D, calcium, weight bearing, the various types of things that you do with trying to strengthen the bone there at OsteoStrong, with improving those biomechanics in the bones to help put down the bone back in there, but without having to go necessarily to medication that you'd really like to avoid if you can.
Well, and so I think that's been one of the frustrations for people, is that with DEXA, you have to wait for several years, between scans, and people feel like they don't know whether the changes that they're making are improving their bone. Does REMS address that? Can you tell quicker with a REMS scan if you're improving bone quality?
Bone quality doesn't change real fast no matter what you do. Okay.
Mhm,
The reason that DEXA scans are done every other year, every 2 years, it's based on Medicare reimbursement. And there are some reasons for that, but we're not going to get into that. That's the reason that they do it so long in between. If you wanted to have your DEXA scan and get it paid for by insurance, you have to wait every 2 years in order to get those. Um, REMS right now is FDA approved, but not approved by Medicare yet.
mhm.
The process is going through the legal process that it has to go through in order to get that. But when it does, it will probably also be limited to reimbursement for every 2 years. But the nice thing is, if you wanted to get them in between, say you wanted to wait only 6 months because you're just anxious, you just want to know, I want to know, am I really doing anything good? And it'll take a good 6 months probably before you'll see a lot of difference, uh, measurable differences. For example, one of the best ways of treating osteoporosis, the most robust way of treating it, is with parathormone. That's the stuff that comes from your parathyroid gland that helps, that works on the bone. Okay, you can give parathormone to people, and the best that you'll get, and which is really good, is 4% per year increase in bone mineral density. That's that's not a huge change, but it's going in the right direction instead of the wrong direction.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
you'd like to know that whatever you're doing, you're at least maintaining status quo or slowly gaining on it, as opposed to uh, losing ground over time. Because all of us, after a certain age, start to lose ground unless you work really hard to avoid that with various, you know, diet, um, exercise, and what have you. So you have to work at it. And most of us nowadays, we're getting more and more sedentary.
right.
The average American is extremely sedentary,
Yeah.
and you will probably start to lose bone faster being sedentary.
Well, and one of my concerns too is a couple of things is that kids aren't as active as they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago. They're not getting that. Not all kids, but a lot of kids, and so a lot of people probably aren't often reaching a high peak bone mass when they are growing, or there's a lot of people that are on medications, even kids, unfortunately. There are some medications that impact bone density. So, it just seems like, it's going to be more and more of an issue as time goes on. So if you've had, okay, so can, let me just say, I have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you. Okay, if you've had a DEXA scan and a REM scan, and they both have significantly different results, why? And which should you, base your decisions on?
So let's make the assumption that it's a DEXA scan without trabecular bone score.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you have to mitigate, like we talked earlier, mitigate those results in your clinical decision making against what the REMS is telling you about the underlying integrity of the bone. So you'll modify your risk of fracture in talking with the patient and how aggressively you want to be in treating it. So yeah, you're looking at different processes with those two things.
Okay. And
Quite frankly, I always like to err on the side of being conservative. So everything else being equal, I would tend to look at whatever is worse and
mm,
try to mitigate that. But again, looking at the whole picture of the other tests that might tell you things aren't as bad as you thought.
well, and I know that's one of the things that happens a lot. I know when I was diagnosed, I started changing my behavior because I was really scared. I was really scared that I was going to fracture. And, then when I looked at my REMS score, I'm a little more comfortable and, more just not as worried. So that's, now how often can you get a REMS scan?
You get one every day if you want. I mean, there's no real downside to it. It just, like we said, the rate of change of the bone mineral density, no matter what you're doing, it's going to be relatively slow. So I wouldn't probably shoot for any more often than maybe every 6 months, 4 to 6 months, depending on how anxious you are about whether or not you're holding things in abeyance.
Okay. All right. Anything else that you'd like to share with us?
I'm just thinking,
I'm going through my questions to see if we missed anything. Um, I think one of my questions is there a reason to get both DEXA and REMS? I don't know if we covered that. Do you think we covered that pretty well?
well, I don't know that we hit it directly, but uh, unless the DEXA scan has the trabecular bone score, I don't think I did both. I don't think that you're gaining anything really above what the RIMS will tell you in that regard. Certainly, if you get a DEXA scan and the bone mineral density looks good, you don't need a RIMS. You know, likely you don't, but that doesn't mean that your underlying integrity isn't what it should be. But certainly, I wouldn't get a RIMS if I had a normal DEXA scan.
But so your opinion is if you only had to get one, if you were paying out of your pocket, REMS is going to give you more information, assuming that a DEXA doesn't have the trabecular bone score. Is that a fair
I think
statement?
so. I think so. The one thing I would mention is that I saw a statistic the other day that 1 in 2 females during their lifetime will have osteoporosis. What would be interesting is to see if the cohort of people that you have coming through, and you follow them longitudinally over the next 10, 20 years, are they able to hold steady? can or even reverse some of that? Are the things that you're doing going to change those statistics over time? Can we get more and more people involved in this so that we don't have that problem later on? Because the mortality, not just morbidity, but mortality after a hip fracture is extremely high.
Yep. Yep,
Now,
that's what's so scary.
yep,
And I know me personally, I have moved out of osteoporosis into osteopenia in my hips and have had a 10% improvement in my spine in 3 years. So, I'm thrilled, and that's no medication. But I'm seeing now my members coming through and having improvements in their DEXA bone density scores. So,
it's something you have to pay attention to. And historically, we haven't. Everybody just kind of,
mhm.
oh, everything will be okay. Everything is wonderful. And you just trip along, right up into a dowager's hump and
Yep.
hip fractures.
Well, and I say this a lot. If I could wave my magic wand, what I think we should be doing is scanning everybody um, early on in their life. Wow, if you scan people before they were finished, if there was some tables that could kind of give you statistic indication of, because I think they say on average you lose 1 to 2% of bone density a year in your life, right? So you should be able to look at where you are at 35 and, plot that out, assuming you don't have any anomalies or go on any medications, and you should kind of have a pretty good idea. So, why not have everybody baselined, and then we would have something to kind of really follow. We don't have that original data, right?
Right, right. It'd be interesting. There is a group out there, and it's young female intense athletes, like the
Mhm.
ones that are going to to Paris. Tend to train so hard they get amenorrheic, and you get amenorrheic and you lose bone. It would be
Mhm.
interesting to follow those elite athletes and see where are they now, and then say, look, this is where you are. And because you're doing that, you're putting yourself at increased risk. You need to do other things to mitigate that. But right now, that's called preventive medicine, and we don't do a lot of preventive medicine. But that is certainly something that should be done.
It's changing. You're going to be part of that.
Yeah,
We're going to prevent osteoporosis and osteopenia.
there you go.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.